Welcome to Radical AI, a podcast about technology, power, society, and what it means to be human in the age of information.
We are your hosts, Dylan and Jess, and in this episode, we explore what is robot regulation and why does it matter.
Today, we interview Ryan Calo, a professor at the University of Washington School of Law. He is a faculty co-director of the University of Washington's Tech Policy Lab, which is a unique interdisciplinary research unit that spans the School of Law, Information School, and Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering. Ryan's research broadly encompasses law and emerging technology.
Ryan is one of the world's foremost experts on robot regulation, and we've even been told that he is one of the people who has been credited with making robot regulation and robot law a field in the first place. It is our pleasure to share this interview with Ryan Calo with all of you. We are on the line with Ryan, and today, as you know, we are talking about robot regulation and why it matters. So my first question to you is, what is robot regulation and why does it matter?
Let me take that in reverse order. So first of all, robots are today and have been for some time a very important, I would say, transformative technology, right? I mean, we have remade the military using robotics. We have remade manufacturing, and when I say we, I mean United States, other industrialized nations have uh, made enormous use of robotics. And there's thought that robots are leaving the theater of war and the factory and the space context and other places where they've been very prevalent. And they're on our streets now, and they're in the skies, and so on. And so it's just a really important set of technologies. And if robotics is as transformative as both its proponents and and detractors say, um, then one of the things that's going to transform, one of the things that's going to change, is going to be law and legal institutions. Otherwise, it's not transformative. I mean, if something has almost no effect on laws or legal institutions, I would argue that that is not a transformative force.
So, what is that effect that it's having on legal institutions? Why is robotics so difficult to govern?
Well, let me just make the usual caveat that robotics are not a single thing, right? I mean, robotics is. I mean, I often define artificial intelligence as a set of techniques aimed at approximating some aspect of human or animal cognition using machines. And that is a pretty high level of generality that includes the sort of 1950s ideas about symbolic logic all the way to, contemporary classifiers and detectors that leverage, you know, deep learning and so on. Similarly with robotics, I tend to think as robotic technology as being technology that can um, sense the world, process what it senses, and then act upon the world. And I mostly use that definition, which is largely out of computer science. Depending on your discipline, people define robots differently, and we can get into that if you want to. But I use the computer science definition, which is itself based on the sense, think, act paradigm, an old psychological action theory. Um, and so I use it largely to distinguish robots from a lot of other technology. So, for example, you and I, we're talking right now on laptops. Laptops can sense. That's why we can hear one another. They have processing power, but laptops generally don't act upon the world, especially not in a physical way, right? Um, Conversely, my kids have remote control cars that have cameras on them. They do act. They have actuators. They act upon the world. They drive around the world. They navigate the world. They sense, but they have no real processing power. They're not robots in the sense that they don't process. And so, though each of these things can act, it can be on a continuum. Mars rover maybe has less onboard processing power than another robot, but it has some. Um, I think all three things need to be there. And so when you have a technology that can sense and think and act, that provides a certain set of challenges for the law that I believe are recurrent. But in addition, there are specific instantiations of robots, drones, for example, cart-based delivery robots, driverless cars, surgical robots, um, that merit context-dependent legal interventions.
Yeah, as I think about this, I almost wonder about what the options are for regulation and how I would, regulate a drone differently than I would regulate a Roomba, et cetera. But I'm wondering before we get into the kind of how we maybe should think about some of these things or some of the options, can we talk about the history of robot regulation? Has there been like a history at either like a local, national, or international level in the law of regulating robots?
I mean, yes, and it sort of depends on how far back you want to go in terms of history. So, very quick primer. I mean, this is I can't. I mean, and feel free to give me the hook on this if I go too far. But right, when we talk about regulation, we talk about law. There are multiple sources of law. There's international law that is largely a function of treaties and other well-established sort of accepted human rights. There is domestic law, which can be legislative in nature or common law. It can be regulatory in nature, coming from like a federal agency. And then it also can develop to state level, local level, right? So there's all kinds of possibilities for the law to get involved. Um, and that's just hard law. There's also a whole world of so-called soft law. Sort of, I think of the leaders of studying soft law as the folks at ASU. They're really into soft law, and that's the idea of things like standards, ethical bodies, anything that's not, kind of command and control or the equivalent. It's not hard law in the sense that it's not, um, legal firm boundaries. Um, and so when you talk about the history of robots, there are a bunch of robot specific laws out there. I mean, I could rattle a bunch off. For example, there are laws that talk about not being able to use a drone to interfere with hunting in some southern states. There's a law in Nevada that is specifically about driverless cars and what kinds of things you have to do in order to test driverless cars in that state, right? Um, there are laws governing um, uh, the approval of this or that robot for a particular purpose. Like there's all these laws out there that have a history. What I've found so fascinating is um, the perennial sense that robots are always in the future. Like robots have been in the future for hundreds of years. It's a very funny, unique thing about them. Like, they always are heralds of the future, but they always have been. And so when I went back and looked at whether or not there was common law, like case judge made law, having to do with robots, I found some absolutely fascinating examples dating back at least to the 1950s. Examples where courts struggled with how to characterize a robot, how to categorize a robot, basically, and how to fit it into pre-existing legal categories. So, for example, there's a case from the 1950s where we're trying to figure out what tariff should attach to robot toys that are being imported from Japan. Okay, and everyone's seen those robots, these cool old robots, you know what I mean, with the little lights and stuff. They're getting imported from Japan, and it's unclear how to tax them. And it's unclear how to tax them because at the present, the tariff schedule makes a distinction between dolls and other kinds of toys. Why? Because of historic trade related regions with Europe. Okay. So how do we know when something's a doll versus another kind of toy? Well, a doll represents something animate at the time. Okay. And so the courts, and so then the regulators are like, okay, well, we're going to tax this a particular way because it's mechanical. It doesn't represent something animate, right? And the importers are like, no, 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 no. We want to be taxed this other way because, of course, it does represent. And so there's this fight, and the court has to come up with like a decision about like, does a robot represent something animate? And the court decides, interestingly, that robots do represent something animate because they're mechanical people, but a toy robot doesn't, because a toy robot represents a robot. Okay, so these are the kinds of struggles that courts have. This idea of whether or not a robot was a doll, it came up so often that eventually they had to amend the tariff schedule and add robotics, like robot toys, as a category, like it was in parentheses, like robots, to clarify this. Another example was following this case about the straightforward robot. There was another case where people were importing uh, a famous robot where it looked like an astronaut, and it had like an astronaut's face inside of this thing, but it was still like everything else about it was robot like, and it had this internal panel that would open up, and and lights would go off and stuff like that. And the people that imported it were like, see, look at this, like, this is a person in here, it's an astronaut, like you can't possibly think this is anything other than a doll. And the court was like, no, 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 although it has human like features, it's still a robot. After all, people don't have guns coming out of their chests. You know what I mean? And so it's like, and so I can just tell you, there is case after case after case involving a difficulty that the court had trying to characterize it. So the law is, robots are not new to the law. Robots are not new to the law. And even though they always herald the future, and we can always ask these fanciful questions about them, courts and legislatures and so on have encountered them before. I mean, when JFK was first elected, there was a huge movement to try to get him to do like a big official workshop around the displacement of labor from automation, which he ultimately didn't do. I mean, but there was like these op-eds about robots taking your jobs that you could just, you change the graphic, but you could just transpose them to today, and it would be the same thing we saw under the Obama administration, whatever years ago.
Yeah, see, it's interesting because I feel like all these examples and different examples that I see in the news, they show that robotic regulation comes after the robot. So usually it goes like robot and then regulation. But it's weird because like you were saying, we're constantly thinking about robots being in our future. And so do you see any cases where the law and the regulation comes before the robot comes, or is it always the case that the law is trying to play catch up with the robotics?
I think it just looks like that. I don't think it's really like that, right? And so I think that if we dig deeper on some of these examples, it just looks that way. It's always looked that way to me. But nowadays, I'm thinking it's not. So, for example, take drones. We're told that, the FAA is so behind, and Congress had to nudge them several times in appropriation acts and get the Federal Aviation Administration to let drones be integrated into domestic skies. And everyone's like, oh, they're not contemplating automation. They're not, how are we going to do delivery robots and everything? Then the companies are like, we're going to go to other jurisdictions where the laws are more open, and we're going to take, drone delivery there. It has been like 10 years. We don't have drone delivery. It's not because of the law. You see what I mean? It's because drone delivery is super hard. Robots are super hard. You know what I mean? I mean, it's really, really difficult to make drone delivery efficient because you have to deal with the energy ratio. The more weight you want to put on that drone, the more it adds to the necessity of having a battery or another form of energy that's hard to do. It has to do with the difficulty of navigating autonomously, because if you're really going to just take a drone and put it and like have somebody fly the drone around, you might as well put somebody on a bicycle and deliver that same package if every single one has to have an operator and so on. And the jurisdictions that have been experimental. And the places where we've relaxed requirements, both in the United States as an experiment or in other jurisdictions, they don't have it either. Same with driverless cars. How long have we had driverless car legislation, for example, in Nevada? I mean, it's been a long time, right? And they said you can test it here, and here's the parameters and that kind of thing. Other places have even fewer restrictions and so on. And we don't have widespread driverless cars. Why? Because it's super hard, because robots are hard. And so I just don't believe this narrative that the law is always catching up to robots. I think the law is like, okay, well, here you go ahead. And then roboticists are like, yeah, well, thank you very much. And then they just can't do it because it's super hard, you know? And so I think that one of the dangers is to act like whatever robot happens to have gotten its shit. Oh, can I swear in this podcast, or is that not? Oh, okay, you can bleep it out if it's ever going to be on NPR or something. So I think that, you know, one danger is that whenever a company gets its shit together enough to come up with a particular instantiation of a robot, and then they go lobby somewhere, usually a state legislature, and tell them, you know, this is how robots are going to work in this context. I think that is a big source of a problem, and it's a big source of a problem because the law is reacting too fast. It's reacting too fast, and I'll give you an example, which is with land-based delivery. You have Starship saying, you know, we have this robot. It's got a certain weighs a certain amount. It goes on wheels. It can do this. It can do that. We want a law that says this is okay. And then trying to look futuristic or whatever, trying to look innovative, this legislature passes these laws saying you can deliver things with robots as long as they have these characteristics, right? You're Boston Dynamic, and you've built Spot that doesn't have wheels, but it can walk upstairs, and it weighs a little more than what you're supposed to have. You know what I mean? And so on. And it does something a little bit differently. All of a sudden, you can't even use it in that state unless you go back to the legislature and say, you know, we're really going to need you to do this. There was an example with the FAA recently. Police are buying these flying systems that are tethered to the ground, but they don't fit within the definitions, either state or federal, of unmanned aerial systems. And so they avoid the regulation that would attach to drones because they're not technically unmanned aerial systems, because they're tethered, is the argument. You know, again, what matters? What matters is the new affordances. What matters is the ability to do something you couldn't do before, or to have to do something differently than you did before. It's the capacity that robots add, not the largely contingent configuration of those robots that matter. And so I think, if anything, law is moving too fast. And if there's problems with robots doing what they're supposed to, it's the robots.
I've done a little bit of research in the field of human robotic interaction. And one of the narratives that surprised me that I came across in some of that research is this word that you've mentioned, innovation, and being on the other side of regulation. So regulation is getting in the way of innovation. And I'm curious, from your perspective, whether that is a true statement as we've seen it on the ground, or how do you put those two terms in conversation with each other?
No, that is okay. There's a lot to say about this. I'm sorry. I feel like I'm a little bit like I'm rambling, but okay. So first of all, of course, if you want the freedom to just do what you want to do, you're going to be like, this is innovation, and any kind of limit on me is going to chill innovation. Do you know what I mean? Of course you're going to say that. Who wouldn't say that, right? And yet the actual picture is much more complicated. So first of all, robotics and artificial intelligence would not be anywhere near where they are, although not as far along as some people believe, if not for initial government investment. You know what I mean? So this innovation, you know where it came from? It came from collecting taxes from people and spending it in a particular way on basic research before there was a commercial incentive to do so. Silicon Valley is built on the military industrial complex that came before it. There's no question about that. My colleague Margaret O'Mara has a great book, and I'm just looking to see if I can spot the title about this, the origins. But you can also see it in Markov's Machines of Love and Grace and other places, right? So that's the truth. It's just that this stuff is, there's no serious robotic or artificial intelligence application that did not have a origin in NSF or DARPA or something like that. Okay. Second of all, there are very well understood ways in which regulation makes innovation possible, and patent is an obvious example. You know what I mean? I mean, what is patent? It's a regulation says you can't copy stuff that other people invented for a certain period of time, right? Not only does patent, I'm not an IP lawyer, but I mean, basically everybody knows, patent is supposed to incentivize innovation. It's a regulation that does that. But in addition, when you can't do something a particular way because there's a patent in your way, the literature suggests that that's often what you get innovation, because you have to accomplish the same thing a different way. You see what I mean? And so like, because you can't do it the patented way, so what other way can you do? And then you go, oh my goodness, this way is actually better, cheaper, faster, whatever it happens to be. Okay. The other thing too is people are not going to adopt things, especially in this more skeptical environment we are now, if they don't believe there's basic safeguards around it. People are not going to take vaccines unless they are convinced that there's a regulatory process that makes that safe. People initially did not want to do banking on the internet because they were deeply afraid, appropriately so, about the prospect of theft and identity theft. And there had to be adequate safeguards put into place, and they turned out to be security standards in that instance, although eventually also security breach notification laws, right? That made people feel comfortable, right? So yes, while there are narrow examples where regulation might stand in the way of some innovation in some cases, right, it is a very complicated picture, and innovation is deployed rhetorically to get out of the way of companies that really are seeking to do a regulatory arbitrage. Because what they say is innovation, innovation, innovation. Then they wait till everybody's taking Uber, and then they use their access to everybody because they're on their apps to tell them they should sign a petition making Uber retroactively lawful. You see what I mean? And so it's complicated, and it is related, I think, to your point, Jess, was about law keeping up with technology, right? That's part of that story. So that if you think about the David Collingridge, the Collingridge dilemma, it's the idea that the problem with technology is you don't know what its societal effects will be until it's already entrenched. And so it's difficult to figure out when to regulate technology, because if you regulate it or too early, you're going to chill innovation. And if you regulate it too late, it will be so entrenched that you will have much less wiggle room. And so you have to find the perfect time and place to regulate. People like Gaia Bernstein have written about when is the perfect place to regulate. That is only true if putting safeguards in advance were neither feasible nor desirable. But my own view is that having institutional structures, having safeguards in advance that are written at a sufficient level of generality so that they're not picking winners and losers in the system, can make everything go apace, and that it's a false dichotomy.
Can we actually unpack this Collingridge dilemma? I've never heard of this before. I think this is really spot on here, because I've heard about a lot of robot regulation now from you mostly, but also I've heard of the other side where there's a lot of robot harm, and we can speak broadly about like AI harm in general too, due to lack of regulation. So like with this dilemma and not knowing, when to regulate, when it's too entrenched or not entrenched enough, like when do we do regulation? How do we know when it's the right time?
So that is a great question. So the Collingridge dilemma comes from a book by David Collingridge that's called The Social Control of Technology, and it has been, I think, misconstrued a bit I don't know willfully or not, but it's been picked up by the sort of techno libertarians who have re reframed it as a pacing problem and a reason that we need permissionless innovation, right? So let me start with the original Coleridge's original point. Coleridge's original point was that um, he was yet another anti-determinist. He was a person who was reacting to determinism about technological determinism, which says essentially that somehow technology follows a particular path and has determined effects on the world, when in fact technology is, you know, one of the central insights of science technology studies is that in fact technology has this complex, you know, iterative, dynamic, mutual relationship with other aspects of society. You know what I mean? And so if that's true, then you don't know what effects the technology will have in advance. You see what I mean? And so and so if you were to intercede too soon, uh, you would be that would be hubris. You would be trying to guess what technology was going to do in the world, and there's no way to do that. However, if you wait too long, then at that point technology will become intermeshed with the world in such a way that it becomes sort of difficult, and your choices are constrained in how you regulate technology because people are used to it, they rely upon it, people have invested in it, and so on. And so, you know, different scholars have looked at uh, how do you optimize, you know, what, you know, when to do it, and they've thought about breaking technology into phases, this phase, that phase, and you should do it during the phase two or whatever. But you know, then they get resistance from the anti-determinists who say, well, that's deterministic, and technology doesn't always go through phases like what you're saying, you know. The truth is that if you go too strong in either direction, you're left in a bad place. So I don't mean literally if you if you intervene too early or if you intervene too late, you're in a bad place from a regulatory standpoint. I mean intellectually. Intellectually, if you let yourself think we can't know anything about technology's impacts, and technology is like not even a different kind, it's like technology is like just like other kinds of social facts, and it doesn't behave the same way, it doesn't raise the same issues, it's just totally different. You know, if you find yourself in that heavily anti-determinist sort of social constructivist idea, and you know, then you're going to be paralyzed. You're never going to be able to channel technology because you can never know anything about it without just observing it. So you wind up with these beautiful um, you know, sort of case studies. Um, I feel like Winner wrote about this, but opening the empty box, opening the black box and finding it empty. You know, you wind up with these beautiful case studies that tell you the intricacies of how technology actually played out in practice, but they're not operationalizable beyond that context. And so you can't use them to channel technology one way or the other, right? Whereas if intellectually you say to yourself, we need to embrace that and let technology play out, and only in retrospect can we just like sort of try to minimize the harms that we see later on, you end up in this techno-libertarian world where, you know, the internet, like hate speech is rampant, misinformation is rampant, um, you know, especially the marginalized are being negatively affected, et cetera. And but we're paralyzed by different kinds of interests who want to preserve immunity for platforms or their ability to do electronic surveillance or whatever happens to be, and we're stuck. And all of a sudden, you know, the combination of federal law, the First Amendment, you know, and so on, makes it impossible for us. We have no room to maneuver. So I think both extremes are wrong. Now, I don't know exactly when the right time is intervene, but rather I know that not all interventions are the same. What you shouldn't do is come in and say, take and reify or enshrine or codify the first example of an instantiation of a technology. Rather, you should ask yourself, what set of affordances does this technology create? You know what I mean? Like, what does this technology permit us to do differently or that we couldn't do before? In the case of drones, it has to do with, the perspective that we're able to take on things. We can see things from above in a way that we couldn't before. Maybe we can even manipulate things that we couldn't reach before. Robotics generally, we can operate in dangerous environments where humans couldn't operate. There are cases involving undersea exploration, for example, and there will be cases involving mining of asteroids and things like that. We can solve problems in ways that no human would have occurred to them to solve it. So all of a sudden we're playing Go or chess differently because we've brought to bear these technologies. So what are the difference in affordances, and what gaps do they create, and what opportunities do they create? I like to talk about sort of gaps and levers. Like what gaps do they create in the law, but what additional levers do they give us to accomplish our goals?
Robotics is interesting to me, especially in reading op-eds, and there's a particular emotional valence of either robots taking our jobs in the economic sense, or just robots replacing humanity in some way that I wasn't around when they invented fire, but I don't know if people would have been writing op-eds about how fire was replacing our jobs, even if it was like adding a tool. So for you, I guess coming from a perspective in law, but maybe just in general, someone who writes and thinks a lot about these things, is robotics different? And if so, why? Like, would we or should we regulate robotics in a different way than the internet or fire or another technology? And if so, why?
Yeah, it's the funny thing about technology is, it's whatever's new. You know what I mean? It's like it's whatever's new. What I can't remember his name right now, so I wish I could attribute this. I don't like to say things without attribution, but another scholar I read talked about how notice how we talk about our technology sector, but it does not include cars or, you know what I mean, or refrigerators or anything else that are certainly technology, right? Let alone fire, or cooking. The chefs are not part of the technology industry, and it's because we associate technology with novelty. And in that way, robots are quintessential technology. I mean, they are literally meant to herald novelty. That's their pretty much their purpose, and that's their purpose for many centuries. I mean, in sort of ancient Arabic times, there's there's like these hydraulic machines that are in these catalogs that are supposed to be wondrous things, way predate the birth of Christ. And so, ancient Greece and so on. And so, but robots are different in other ways too, and they have to do with the fact that we have difficulty. They have a social meaning that other technologies don't have. We're a bit hardwired to react to anthropomorphic technologies like robots as though they were really people. And that is special and different and merits particular consideration, but it's also been the source of interpretive difficulty for the courts. When the courts have struggled with putting robots into a particular place, it's because they exist in some liminal world. I mean, I can give you countless examples. I'll just tell you one of my favorite stories, if I may, but this is one of my favorite cases of all time. I love it so much. Okay. So in the 1990s in Maryland, okay, there was this Chuck E. Cheese. You guys know Chuck E. Cheese, I imagine, yeah. But for any listener who doesn't know Chuck E. Cheese is like a kid's pizza restaurant. And one of the attractions of it is that it has used to have these animatronic bands, these giant caricature, these characters, this mouse, this vaguely xenophobic Italian figure, whatever, a bunch of sort of, a bunch of. I also want listeners to know that both Jess and Dylan are laughing at my really good jokes, and you just can't hear them because they're on mute, but I can see them and they're laughing.
So Ryan, it's only because I spent at least 5 of my birthday parties growing up in the 90s going to Chuck E. Cheese, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Let the record reflect that this is funny. So anyway, so you have these animatronic things, and so these enterprising tax authorities went into Chuck E. Cheese, and they're looking for ways to have money, and they said, you know what? I think we're going to need to charge a performance tax on the food you're serving here, because there's obviously a performance. I mean, every 15, 20 minutes, these animatronic things come alive and they do like a whole thing. And so a court had to decide whether or not robots could be said to perform. And at issue was like a considerable tax on all the food sold within every Chuck E. Cheese in the state of Maryland. You know what I mean? And the court sort of hemmed and hawed and looked up these definitions and whatever, and decided ultimately that robots could not be said to perform because performance requires spontaneity, and that these robots are incapable of spontaneity. Now, that may have been true of Chuck E. Cheese robots from the 1990s, right? But it certainly is not an adequate description of all robots all the time. And there are many examples I can cite to where there is the appearance, at least, of spontaneity. You don't know in advance what they're going to do. But the fact is like, it was about that difficulty. Like, are they performing like people? Or are they just playing something like a jukebox? But you don't have a situation where people are like, there's a performance because the performance is coming in over the speaker, or there's a performance, you know what I mean? Like that did not raise the same question. It was the category problem, and psychologists talk about this. Psychologists talk about, I mean, my colleague, Peter Kahn, and others have written about, who's a psychologist and a human robot interaction person, have written about the potential need for a new ontological category for robots, because they just don't seem to fit in with like brick person. You know what I mean? They're just in between.
See, it's interesting. I imagine part of the difficulty in, for example, let's keep using this example of regulating Chuck E. Cheese robots, is that we don't actually know how to do it because it is so novel. And so I'm wondering, like, who is making these decisions? Is it the people who specialize in Chuck E. Cheese robots? Is it a lawyer who's particularly fascinated in Chuck E. Cheese? Like, who is actually making these decisions, and what makes them capable of making these decisions, or maybe what makes it difficult for them to make these decisions?
Well, okay, so that's a great question. So in the case of the common law, or in the case of statutory interpretation, which is what both of those cases I gave you about the tariffs and about performance tax were about, it's really a court that has to make the decision, and courts are pretty adept at that. I mean, there's a whole structure in place that allows for bringing in external expertise. At the appellate level, you can have amicus briefs from people that work on the issue, and so there are mechanisms to get judges the expertise that they might need in order to resolve a particular issue, right? It's imperfect. Judges certainly, make decisions I wouldn't make because they have, in my view, an outdated mental model. Indeed, I think while it may be true that the robots in the Chuck E. Cheese example were not spontaneous, I don't think it's true as a category that robots can't be spontaneous. I think the trouble comes in when you have lawmakers who don't have adequate expertise, or you have regulatory agencies that don't have adequate expertise. They have a lot of expertise in what they do, aviation. They have a lot of expertise in Food and Drug Administration and whatever. They have expertise in certain things, but they don't have expertise in the way that robots work. And I'll give you a couple of examples of, I think, I'll give you an example of a time when I think, well, let me back up. To me, a rather dramatic example of how agencies have struggled with cyber physical systems, and in fact, how they've kind of grown or evolved to some extent, is, do you remember when there was that Toyota sudden acceleration problem? So there was this issue years ago, though not that many years ago, where people who drove the certain kind of Toyota were reporting that all of a sudden the car would accelerate, and some accidents were blamed on this, and they thought it was so Toyota said, well, no, this is a human error. Like we made the something about the pedal that sticks, or we put the carpet in there in such a way that it's causing this, and so it's just we got to fix this, but it's mechanical in nature. But people told Congress that no, actually this is like maybe a software bug, and that's a big deal. If there's a software bug that's making Toyotas accelerate, that's a huge deal because there's millions of them. So so Congress goes to the Department of Transportation, understandably, and says, hey, we need to know whether or not the sudden acceleration is from the code. And the Department of Transportation's like, oh God, I mean, I don't know how we're going to figure this out. You know what I mean? Like like, how are we going to figure this out? So what they end up doing is they end up going to NASA. Okay. They end up going to NASA and they're like, you folks work on this, you know what I mean? And so imagine that for a moment. You know what I mean? Imagine that you go to NASA and you're like, could you take a break from putting robots on Mars for a moment and look at this Toyota for us? And so NASA looked at the Toyota, looked at the code, looked at everything else, because they build these systems. And after months, they ended up largely clearing Toyota of there being a software bug. You see what I mean? But I mean, that's not a sustainable model. You can't have NASA look at everything, and I think similarly with the Boeing problems with the Boeing jet. It was just so difficult for them to figure out, where was the problem, where was it, because that expertise is lacking. But I think it's getting better. I mean, they're having to hire more and more people to do this. And so when the Uber accident, autonomous Uber killed that woman in Arizona, right? National Highway Transportation Station, DOT was able actually to do a pretty thorough assessment, but they did need the input from Uber itself. They needed a lot of cooperation from Uber itself. Anyway, my basic point is just that I think there's a dearth in expertise of a particular kind, and I have in fact argued that we ought to have like an agency that the whole purpose of which is to help other policymakers make wiser decisions about robots and artificial intelligence. And I've argued, I have a Brookings piece from years ago that's called "The Case for the Federal Robotics Commission." I gave it as a talk at the Aspen Ideas Festival years ago, and so on. So this is ideas, I have about like having adequate expertise because it's needed.
As we move towards wrapping up the interview, I'm going to, I guess, ask you a question that's connected to what you just said, but also is a blatantly unfair question. What does ideal robot regulation look like? And does it exist, I guess?
Yeah, no, so I really think it's context specific. Okay. I mean, so often you hear about artificial intelligence that you can't regulate it because it's not a thing. You know what I mean? It's and you think of it as like it's a genie in a bottle, and you open that bottle up and you just apply it to a different. I'm sure you've heard, not on your podcast because the people that you interview don't think that way, but you've heard other people talk that way about AI. Is that you just apply it to everything and it just makes it better. And so there's this mental model that it's like a magic genie in a bottle, and it wouldn't make sense or be desirable to regulate such a thing, right? But there are a bunch of ways in which the existence of AI exposes a breakdown in regulation or law that we can and should fix. And one example that I think is not obvious is the interaction with anti-hacking law. Okay, so for example, if you want to, the way that we find out whether artificial intelligence that's been deployed in the real world is harming people, okay, so is making them unsafe because the threshold for object detection has been set too low on an Uber, so it hits somebody crossing the street, or it harms people because it doesn't work for people of color. It disproportionately recommends longer sentences or makes or causes the police to believe that there's going to be an outbreak of violence in a Black community when that isn't the fact. Um, the way we find these things out is because researchers kick the tires on these systems. You know what I mean? Like journalists, sometimes lawyers, um, academic researchers look at these systems and see how they work and see what their impacts are. Yet there is always the concern or the sword of Damocles hanging over these researchers that the company is going to get mad and going to threaten to sue them. And in fact, if you think that sounds like ridiculous, I mean, just think about the other day, Facebook sent a cease and desist letter to NYU over its political ad scraping tool. You know what I mean? Basically saying, stop scraping our system, even though the way that the researchers had architected it is they created a browser tool that people voluntarily opt into, and then that shows the researchers so like the users themselves are like giving a view into the system, not and so nevertheless, Facebook is cease and desist letter, presumably on threatening them under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, right? So I believe that the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and other laws like it ought to all have exceptions for research to hold these systems more accountable, and that would be better for the whole ecosystem, right? There's another quick example about the same topic is, this, but there's something called adversarial machine learning. I'm not sure. I mean, maybe you don't, but I assume you do. But adversarial machine learning, for anyone who's listening who doesn't know, is the idea that you would take a trained system that's supposed to make decisions or classify things in the world, and purposely perturb images or change the world so that you trick that system, that you make the system see something that isn't there. For example, my colleagues showed that you could slightly perturb a stop sign in such a way that none of us would recognize a big difference, but you put these stickers on the stop sign and all of a sudden a driverless car perceives it as a speed sign. You know what I mean? So that's an example that comes out of University of Washington. So if you do that, that is scary because you have deployed systems that will then potentially be tricked, right? But it's not hacking under the traditional understanding of hacking, because you're not bypassing a security protocol. You're not breaking into the system by exceeding your authorization or having no authority. You're not breaking into the system and changing things, but rather you're just giving it a stimulus that makes it behave in a way that you want. And said another way, as systems become more smarter and smarter and smarter, they can be tricked even if they can't be hacked. And yet our definitions of anti-hacking, the ways that we try to prevent malicious hacking, define hacking as bypassing a security protocol and getting into that system and exfiltrating things or damaging things. Whereas this is just a way in which you're just tricking systems by understanding how the models work. So I've argued, and my colleagues have argued in a paper called "Is Tricking a Robot Hacking?" that we need to change security standards so that it becomes inadequate security to release an AI into the world that's too easy to fool. Now, these are concrete changes to the law that are absolutely necessitated by artificial intelligence. Do you see what I mean? There's no other way to think about them as that than as that. But they're not regulating AI per se. They're just changing laws and legal institutions and precedents to adapt to the prevalence of AI, which in turn has certain affordances that didn't exist before, certain negative affordances and positive affordances.
Well, Ryan, clearly there's so many more questions that we could explore on this topic with you, but unfortunately we've reached the end of our time. So for those listeners who might be policymakers, researchers, roboticists, and everywhere in between who are looking to take this conversation a bit further, where is the best place for them to go to maybe see a little bit more of your work or to get in touch with you?
Well, I'm easy to find. I mean, I'm just, I'm a law professor at University of Washington. You can just look me up. I'm on Twitter at RCALO. But the place I really want to direct people interested in this conversation is the We Robot Conference. We Robot. It is the annual Robotics and Law conference, the premier conference, at least in North America, if not more broadly. And it's where technologists, roboticists get together with law people, law professors, policymakers, and talk about these issues. We do it every year. The 10th anniversary is this fall. Check out We Robot.
We'll be sure to include all of those links as well as many more in the show notes. But for now, Ryan, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about all of this with us.
Oh, it was fun. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Jess, the question that started us off today was, what is robot regulation and why does it matter? And I think Ryan gave us a wonderful set of explanations and descriptions about what robot regulation is out in the field. And now I'm wondering, for both of us, what do we think? Why does it matter? So let's start with you. Why does it matter?
Whew, yeah, really throwing me the softball there, aren't you? So yeah, robot regulation, I'm not going to speak to why it matters for everyone, because I think Ryan just outlined some amazing information for all of us that was really good breadth description of why this matters in many different domains. But I think one of the biggest things that stood out for me in this conversation was that robot regulation is something that is temporal and has temporal importance. And when I say that, I mean that the timing of our regulation is really, really important for making sure that we don't cause harm to society. And I just keep coming back to this cooling ridge principle that he was talking about, in that if we start regulating too soon, we don't know what our technologies are going to be harmful and in what ways. And if we start regulating too late, then it's already super entrenched in society and we trust these systems too much and it's so embedded that it's just too late to do anything. And I never really thought about that before with tech regulation in general, is that I guess I just always made the assumption that, the earlier that we begin to speculate about the harms of technology, the better. But after this conversation with Ryan, I'm realizing that it matters that we think about when we're thinking about regulation. It's kind of meta, but I never really thought about that before, and I thought that was really interesting. What about you, Dylan?
So as a social scientist, why I think robot regulation matters is because I think it really feeds into how we think about ourselves as humans and also as a society. Like questions about what it means to be categorized as a robot versus as an android versus as just a cell phone versus a human versus a dog versus all these different categories that we've constructed into our lives that we create meaning out of. And that question of regulation persists in all of it, right? We've created the law in order to put boundaries, especially moral boundaries, around things that are right and wrong and things that can happen and things that can't happen. And so when we talk about robots and when I think about robots as a category, I can't help but think about, humans as a category, and then questions of what is not human but also looks like a human or talks like a human, and then if it walks and talks like a human, is it a human? Those kind of bigger questions around robotics. And that's not to say that all of these ideas are just high flying either. I think the reason why this matters is because there were real immediate consequences to how we are defining these categories, especially the category of robot. And I think that plays out economically, in terms of the workforce, in terms of how we think about information, how we think about the category of human, how we treat different people. It doesn't all really, this is so wide reaching. And that's something I really appreciated about this conversation with Ryan, is just how big of an umbrella robot regulation is for something that you would think is so specific in time and place, or just has emerged within the last even 70 years or whatever. It's it really, I think, impacts a lot more than we think it does.
Yeah, totally. And I think you just reminded me of another big takeaway that I was actually thinking in the background of our entire conversation with Ryan. And I think it's that in the AI ethics and just responsible tech space, this is something you and Dylan and I have kind of been discussing a little bit too recently. there's a lot of lip service that happens. And so there's a lot of like vague statements of action that we tell our community, like, well, there's a problem with AI, there's a problem with technology, there's a problem with robots, regulate it or regulate them. And that's kind of just where we leave it. Like, I don't really say like, and how or and what that actually means and how we do that. And I'm in this class right now that's taught by one of my PhD advisors, Casey Fiesler, about technology, ethics, and policy. And for the first time, I'm kind of like diving into the weeds of what it actually means to regulate technologies and realizing that in certain case studies, there's always like a loophole in every law you could create. There's always some harm that's going to be done to some people based off of the principles that we base our norms and our regulations on. And there's never really like a perfect answer for anything legally. And so it's such like a granular and complex system. So to hear Ryan actually speaking to what some of these ideas for regulation are and what some of these laws historically have been and how they've played out over time, I think was just like really nice to finally hear, instead of just like the vague, let's regulate it, more of like the intricate, I guess, unpacking of the how and the what that actually means.
As we look at these different areas and domains of AI and technology, and where we look at like the industry, and now we're looking at law, and we look at the academy, it's almost disheartening to me to see like such similarities in some of the issues that we're looking at, especially in terms of like who is making decisions that impact like wide swaths of people, or I guess robots in this case. But like thinking like systemically, it's kind of like it's still a little scary to me to be like, actually the same. And this is something that Dr. Timnit Gebru said when she was on the show, where like, actually that like academy over here on one side of the fence and industry on the other side of the fence is a false dichotomy, because you have the people in the academy who are being employed as consultants to the industry to then make decisions, and then those people are also going to go be experts on like the Congress panels, which will then inform the briefs that create the policy. And it's just like, it's systems are systems to a certain degree, and there are certain people and certain I guess identities which are being represented in these decisions to a much larger degree than other certain identities. And that is, we talk about power a lot on this show, and that's kind of, I think, at the heart of it. And law is all about power and exercising power. And so I think just one thing that I was thinking about during this conversation with Ryan is just like how the systems of power are enacted, and then also like who is there, who are creating these systems of power and recreating these systems of power.
Absolutely. And of course, this was only one example of systems of power that we've explored on this show, and we will continue to explore how power is distributed generally unevenly and inequitably throughout the ways that we create our technologies. But for now, that's it for today's show. So for more information, please visit the episode page at radicalai.org.
And if you enjoyed this episode, we invite you to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or your favorite podcatcher. Catch our new episodes every week on Wednesdays. Join our conversation on Twitter at RadicalAIPod. And as always, stay radical.
Good candor on that one.
Yeah. Got some fire in my belly. Got some robot regulation.
In your belly.
In my belly.
I want to get that checked out.
Do they have doctors for that? Is it like a chiropractor? A robot practor? A robot?
A chiro robot?
A chirobot. That's what we mean.
That
sounds a
sounds
different way with this.
like it needs to be regulated.
And that's a good ending point. All right. Good.